This week, we are going to discuss both sculpture and architecture. There are many terms from two-dimensional art that fit both sculpture and architecture, so we're going to focus on newer terms. I'd also like to remind everyone that this doesn't cover everything from the book and from these areas. We cover many different media, so we can't touch on all aspects. And the lecture has some material that the book doesn't cover, and the book covers some material that's not in here. Be sure to review the chapters in Spore and take good notes this week. Both sculpture and architecture are three-dimensional, which is why I've chosen to group them together this week. Remember that objects that are three-dimensional exist in our space, have form, are tangible, meaning they can be touched, and may be functional. We'll start with sculpture. Sculpture exists and functions very differently from two-dimensional art. We're going to explore sculpture's dimension, the material and tools used, methods, composition, and reasoning. Let's start by reviewing dimension. One-dimensional would be a line. Two-dimensional is when lines connect to create a form and take shape. One way to remember this is that two-dimensional works can be filled in or colored with color, but a line, while able to be a color, cannot be filled in. Three-dimensional objects are things that we can touch and interact with. A canvas, for example, is three-dimensional, but the image on it is not. So while two-dimensional works may give the impression of being three-dimensional, they are not. There are some key terms describing types of sculpture that you'll want to keep in mind. Full round can be viewed from any angle. These are very complex. Spore writes, freestanding and three-dimensional sculpture forces sculptors to concern themselves with practicalities of engineering and gravity. Often, these pieces are created to function within a specific environment. Relief includes both two-dimensional and three-dimensional qualities. It can include a background. Both landscapes and atmospheric elements are possible, but it cannot be viewed from all angles in most cases. Linear is more abstract. It can occupy three-dimensional space. However, the composition relies on materials that give the impression of lines. Wires, string, and other flat materials are used in linear sculpture. Here we have two examples of full rounds. The first is l'arrivée du jour sans fil, which is French for the arrival day without sheet. It is bronze-on-bronze sculpture by Chinese artist Lo Li Rong. She's a contemporary artist. Contemporary is the academic way of saying modern day. In terms of art, humanities, and history, the term modern actually applies to the late 1800s and early 1900s. So Rong is a contemporary artist. I have two views of her sculpture here. Notice the movement and the realism. Not only does a figure move, but so does the draped skirt and her hair. The other is a stylized, almost abstract piece by Henry Moore. Henry Moore was a modernist sculptor. His work falls within the modern period and pushes limits much the way many artists tried to do at the time. Recumbent figure gives the impression of being a person, possibly a male. The viewer's impression of the image, however, changes based upon what part the viewer looks at. Before continuing on, I suggest pausing the video for a moment to think about the importance of the materials used with each sculpture. Would Rong's piece have the same effect if it were made out of clay or wax? What about Moore's sculpture? If it were bronze instead of stone, what would that do to your impression of it? There are no right or wrong answers. Here are two examples of relief sculptures. Relief sculpture uses a background, and the sculpture cannot be viewed from all angles. It mimics some of the qualities of two-dimensional works. There are generally three types of relief. Low relief sculpture is one that projects only a small distance from its base. High relief sculptures project by at least their depth. Staccato is similar to low relief, and some consider it a type of low relief, but it's a subtle type of relief associated with the artist Donatello, and it is created by partly rendering with finely engraved chiseled lines, partly carved in relief. An example of low relief would be a coin. Here I have an American quarter. American quarters are currently made out of copper and nickel, but previously they were made out of silver. Another example of low relief would be the limestone relief pictured here. The relief pictures Eurytion, who is a mythological Greek king and hero and an Argonaut. The relief pictures him herding cattle. Limestone was very popular in the ancient Greek and Egyptian art. It was often used in funerary art, as limestone would help with decomposition. High relief often gives the impression that the figures are coming out of the background. For a sculpture to be high relief, at least half of the object's circumference must be lifted from the background. Triton in Amphitrite is carved from marble, which is another popular material in ancient cultures. Notice how much of the figures are removed from the background. The ivory Passion of the Christ features its characters popping out of the background and each other. It creates a sense of perspective and atmosphere, much like what we've already seen in two-dimensional works. Staccato relief almost mimics that of low relief, and images of it could be mistaken for drawing. Donatello is credited for innovating this technique, which is much more subtle than low relief works. Here's one of the images of the Feast of Herod. Michelangelo lived after Donatello, but adapted many of his practices and styles. We'll see an example of this in just a bit. There's a wide variety of materials and tools that can be used in sculpture. The list here and what the book provides are not complete. Materials include metals, stone, wood, man-made materials like plastic, and paints and glazes can be added to works. Scoria goes into detail about the different methods used to create sculpture. The terminology is key in understanding how sculptures are created. Subtraction begins with a large piece of material, and it's chiseled, cut, whittled down, etc. To create an image. Construction relates to the various materials used to build the piece. And substitution means to transform material from a plastic, molten, or fluid state into a solid state. Manipulation is taking a malleable or pliable material and forming it into an image. Michelangelo's David is a perfect example of the subtraction method. The sculpture began as a large piece of marble, about 17 feet tall. Notice how Michelangelo chose to keep the legs fairly close together. This helps anchor the piece. You may want to pause the video for a moment to examine the detail and look at where most of the weight lays. Consider reviewing the URL at the end of my citation. It includes great background details about the sculpture. For example, the piece of marble Michelangelo used was originally worked on by Donatello 50 years earlier. Donatello had stopped his work because he found the marble to be flawed. A flaw in marble can create many problems when executing a sculpture, especially during the Renaissance. Most tools were handmade, and most work relied on what the artist could see and feel. If there were a flaw, even if it were small, it would be near impossible to tell how much of an impact that flaw could or would have on the piece. If it were flawed, then Michelangelo probably found a way to work around the flaw. This is a constructed abstract sculpture by physicist Carlo Sequin. He designed the sculpture and it was fabricated by X1 Company of Pro Metal Division. This is an example of where math and art meet. With subtraction, there are certainly calculations and a lot of brainstorming. This piece, as well as many other types of construction, requires both vision and an understanding of mathematical principles, starting with geometry and going beyond. Substitution is an interesting process. It requires the use of a mold to sculpt or create the work. These molds are often made by the artist. For example, when I took a three-dimensional art class as an undergrad, I created my own molds out of clay, which I would fill with plaster. A good example of manipulation would be ceramics. Manipulation is the use of a malleable medium like clay, which is then worked until it becomes something. In the case of this example, that would be a porcelain vase. For just a moment, I want to call attention to the date, which is circa, again, which means about. So circa 960 to 1270, that's a wide date range. Occasionally, when an object like a vase is found, the processes for determining age can be inaccurate. The piece could be too far damaged, or the piece may have been preserved by chemicals that make it difficult to determine age. In some cases, the test for determining when a piece was made could damage the work, so restorers and researchers rely on other information, like the style of piece and where it was found. Three-dimensional shapes also use composition. In fact, three-dimensional art uses the same elements and principles as two-dimensional art, albeit in different ways. Many of the elements of two-dimensional art apply to sculpture. In three-dimensional art, the work has literal mass, taking up space and having density. Line and form are used. Now pay attention to what is there and what isn't. Surface area of the form is closed, whereas the space surrounding the form would be negative space. If you think back to Michelangelo's David, the actual sculpture has a closed form, but the space between the right arm and leg, or the slight space between the legs, would be negative space. Color is still important, even if the work isn't painted or glazed. It is still visual and can be used to create variation, depth, and possibly a relationship with an or the environment. Sculpture is physical in three-dimensional art rather than applied. And there are two principles. Proportion, the relationship of the different shapes. Is something too large in comparison to something else. And repetition, rhythm, harmony, and variation. Now I'd like you to think about the reasoning. Pause the video and consider the following. What reasoning is there to create certain types of sculptures? As a hint, think of Michelangelo's David or the Meiping vase. Then think about why artists create three-dimensional images versus two-dimensional. Beyond types of skill, why would people choose to create three-dimensional images and objects that don't necessarily have a use? A few reminders before moving on to architecture. There is more terminology in the chapter about sculpture. Be sure to think about the relationship between sculpture and two-dimensional art, and think about how sculpture and building function together. And finally, think about how other forms of sculpture not covered here, artwork, doll making, candle making, pastry art, linear sculpture that we didn't cover it in depth, and more. If you need to take a short break, feel free to pause the video for a moment. Otherwise, let's dive into architecture. In sculpture, and often two-dimensional art, creativity and mathematics, even science, come together. But architecture takes those relationships to another level. Two- and three-dimensional art can be functional, but the purpose of architecture is function. For example, housing and shelter, business, emergency, bridges, monuments. Architecture is not always recognized as an art form. For example, think of the name of the architect who built your home, whether it's a house, apartment, etc. Who was it? With art, viewers do not, or at least should not, change it, but architecture is constantly changing. Often, there is a difference in domain or ownership. Art is open to interpretation. but not always revision. Architecture breaks from this. For example, think about home renovations and updates to buildings. Spore defines architecture as the art of sheltering. The term sheltering is used broadly. Spore expands the definition to mean both physically and spiritually from the raw elements of the unaltered world. So architecture is meant to be practical, and it has 10 fundamental elements according to Spore. These elements are structure, building materials, line, repetition, balance, scale, proportion, context, space, and climate. In this lecture, we will discuss structure, building materials, scale, proportion, context, and climate. The other elements are ones discussed under 2- and 3-dimensional art. They're still important, and you still need to read those sections in Spore. The first fundamental element we'll discuss is sculpture. Spore discusses several types of structures. For the purposes of this lecture, we will discuss post and lintel and arches, but don't forget about the others. So lintels are horizontal beams that are placed on top of vertical supports, or posts. This is a very early and basic construction method. Think of Stonehenge. The Greeks built on this principle to create columns and capitals. Here I've created my own diagram to show a basic post and lintel construction. The lintel is placed on top and supported by the 2 posts. The longer the lintel, the more support it will need. Next, let's discuss arches. These structures can define large spaces because they transfer outward from the center, the keystone, to its legs, piers, columns, or door and window jambs. In my image, the keystone is the top of the arch. That central point of the arch is important for bearing weights. Arches can be joined to form other 3-dimensional objects like vaults and domes. 2 main types of vaults are tunnel vaults and groin vaults. Tunnel vaults look like tunnels, and groin vaults meet and look like a groin as pictured in the first diagram. Arches are also used to form domes. To do this, the arch requires pendentives, pictured in the second image. Here, I have examples of all 3 structures. The Temple of Athena Nike used the post and lintel construction. It uses ionic columns, which are characterized by the scroll-like tops joining to the lintel. Other Greek structures use Corinthian and Doric columns as well. The next structure is the barrel vault at the Basilica Saint Madeleine. This is a tunnel vault. There are multiple arches used to elongate the space. And finally, we have the dome of the U.S. Capitol. The full building also includes post and lintel construction. The building materials used for architecture are just as varied as they are for 2-dimensional art and sculpture, and are often dependent on the era. For example, the Romans didn't use plastics, available materials. The ancient Greeks wouldn't have used California redwood trees. Climate and geography also play a role. The beach house doesn't make sense in the Arctic. The text focuses on 4 primary materials. Stone, like rocks, bricks, and cut blocks, used in conjunction with materials like mortar. These are used in the construction of weight-bearing walls. Concrete. The concrete used by the Romans called for a concoction of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, mixed together with volcanic rocks and spread into wooden molds that were then immersed in more seawater. It was actually more sturdy and longer lasting than concrete we use today. Wood is a renewable resource that is pliable and useful for framing. And finally, there's steel. Spore writes that this material gives almost limitless possibilities for construction. Let's round out the terminology by discussing scale, proportion, context, and climate. These are elements that you are probably familiar with already. Scale refers to the size of the building. Proportion is a relationship of individual elements to each other. Now consider the aesthetic implications if objects are out of proportion. Also, think about what happens if the materials and accessories, for example, windows and doors, are out of proportion. Think about what could go wrong if the number of windows in a wall is out of proportion with load-bearing elements like posts, or if a wall is placed within a load-bearing wall. Context involves things like location, environment, and purpose. Here are some questions to think about. Does it make sense to place a small summer cottage in the center of Times Square in New York? Does a skyscraper belong in the middle of the Serengeti? Would a beach house make sense in the North Pole? Finally, climate is important because it often changes. Architecture can adapt to the environment, but climate will not adapt to man-made structures. Sustainability is important. So think, can a piece of artwork stand the test of time? Do the works that were put up require materials that may no longer be available in the near future? I'd like to round out the lecture with some very specific examples. Architecture exists for many reasons: home and shelters, businesses, schools, and for government. Religion, however, has played a significant role in the evolution of architecture. Religion has impacted the style of architecture and informed the function of architecture. To start, compare these images. Many of us are probably familiar with the Amish, as Ohio has a pretty significant Amish population. When the Amish create a structure or anything else, it is with purpose, and they are careful to focus primarily on function. While the Amish hay barn, pictured here, does have aesthetically pleasing elements, it is plain in comparison to Grundtvig's church. The Amish avoid ornamentation as part of their expression of faith, but many other Christian denominations rely on ornamentation in religious design. Jensen Klint's design reaches high toward the sky, and it draws the viewer's eyes up toward heaven. It was built in 1940, during the modern period, and uses strong lines to do this. It's both a product of its time and religion. But Amish dwellings could exist in any time period. Here we have the Temple of All Religions, which was designed and implemented by Ilder Kanov in Russia. He wanted to create a temple that would serve any and all religions. While it does serve various religions, its purpose is not necessarily for worship, but for belonging. It's meant to bring the religions together in understanding. Looking at it, think about how the different elements speak to different religions. There is a spire to the right that is reminiscent of Christian tradition. The center dome has Byzantine, Islamic, and Orthodox elements. Now, look at the blue mosque in the center. How does it interact with the space around it? The mosque has multiple domes and spires. It employs elements of both symmetry and asymmetry. It also contrasts with its environment. The blue of the mosque is subtle, so that it can contrast with the blue of the sky. The tree in the front point to the scale of the structure. Its stature is clear within its space. And we also have Temple 1 at Tikal. This is one of 3 Mayan temples that were at Tikal. Each temple was a pyramid similar to what was built in ancient Egypt. The temple draws the viewer's eyes upward toward the top of the temple and to the heavens. Here we have the Sarura Pagoda in Taipei, China. It extends far above the trees and is topped with an ornamental spire. This also draws the viewer's eyes upward. It's a Buddhist temple, and pagodas were used for housing Buddhist treasures. They featured eaves that would give the appearance of stacked blocks. Next, we have the Taj Mahal. It was built in the 17th century by the Emperor Shah Jahan as a monument to his deceased wife, Mumtaz Mahal. This monument was built in memoriam, so its religious aspect is a little different, but it too pays homage to something that is highly revered. The Taj Mahal is more than just a building. It also uses the landscape. There is a pool and gardens leading the viewers to the entrance of the building. The 4 surrounding spires, called minarets, also lead the viewer towards the center. The Taj Mahal is perhaps one of the more glamorous pieces of architecture. It uses gold relief glaze, mason work, and inlaid stones, all of which lend to its glistening appearance. The third image is of a Japanese Shinto shrine. This particular shrine was erected for Amaterasu Omikami, a Shinto sun goddess. Shinto is a religion that pays respect to nature. This shrine uses post and lintel construction in the front. It uses basic lines so that it functions within nature and not in opposition to it. The last 2 pieces I'll discuss are the Old Stone Church and the Second Temple Western Wall. The Old Stone Church is located in downtown Cleveland. It's made with local Berea sandstone from Berea, Ohio. It features 3 points: the central point above the church's main doors, a smaller tower, and a traditional church spire. Before the emergence of the Beaux-Arts period, or the City Beautiful movement that swept the U.S. in the early 20th century, it was one of the taller buildings. It was central to the central business district of the city and would have been easy for churchgoers to access. The western wall of the Second Temple is all that remains of the Hebrew temple that used to exist in Jerusalem. The first temple was also called Solomon's Temple and was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar around the 6th century BCE. It was rebuilt in the 2nd century BCE, but it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE to control the Jewish peoples and early Christians. Currently, the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, is still a place of reverence and political debate. Because of its proximity to Muslim monuments, control is often contested. In what is left of the temple, we can see the use of brick, rock, mortar, and concrete. Considering it was rebuilt 2,200 plus years ago, it is a testament to the sturdiness of ancient materials, artisanship, and craftsmanship. Because this was a combined lecture, there are quite a few sources cited here. As you continue working on your living art photojournals, feel free to use these sources to lead you to other works of art. You shouldn't copy the works featured in the lectures or in the text, but you can use those as a guide. Another quick note, if you do want to use some works from the text, use the second half of the book, as that will not be explored this term. If you have any questions on sculpture or architecture, let me know. I look forward to reading what you guys come up with on the discussion board.